It's my pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Kevin Becker. Kevin is a licensed clinical psychologist and senior partner with ORI Consulting, a global crisis consulting firm. For 25 years, he specialized in the areas of psychological trauma and crisis. He served as clinical instructor in the Harvard Medical School Department of Psychiatry and with Marsh Crisis Consulting, where he worked with Ambassador Paul Bremer in advising governments and public and private organizations on how best to prepare for and respond to crisis. I wish we had known each other a few years ago. He served for 10 years as director of the Trauma Center in Boston, an internationally renowned research and treatment facility specializing in psychological trauma. He's assisted governments and organizations following major disasters such as 9/11, the 2004 tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, the Kashmir earthquake in 2005, and the Boston Marathon bombings. He has assisted numerous communities, large and small, in preparing for and responding to a wide variety of tragedies, ranging from high-impact crimes to natural disasters. Since 2006, he's been the director of the Massachusetts Victim Assistance Academy, which trains crime victim service providers for the Massachusetts Office for Victim Assistance, and was recently appointed by the Department of Justice, the Office for Victims of Crime, as the training and technical consultant to the nationwide network of victim assistance academies. He's the founding chairperson of the Massachusetts Disaster Response Network for the Massachusetts Psychological Association. He consults nationally and internationally on a regular basis. He's produced an award-winning documentary entitled PTSD Beyond Survival. He's authored globally distributed manuals on caring for children and adults following disaster and tragedy, and he's a frequent speaker and trainer on issues of psychological trauma and crisis. It goes without saying that we are enormously indebted to him for making the journey here and privileged to be able to listen to Dr. Kevin Becker as he joins us right now. Thank you, Kevin, very much.
Thank you, Clive. I'd like to begin actually by thanking the organizers of today's event for asking me to be part of it and to speak to you all this morning. So I want to say, I can't really see them, but I want to say a special thank you to Susie DeYoung with Sandy Hook Promise, Jennifer Barahona with the Sandy Hook Community Fund, and Stephanie Chinqua with the Resiliency Center of Newtown for really pulling together a very impressive day. It was a lot of work, and I'm really honored to be invited. And I also want to say a thank you to those folks who've traveled here from far away to share their stories and to really help make this a meaningful and special day. You guys are really the experts. I mean, you heard all of what I've done, but I'm not the expert the way you guys are the experts. So as the title of today's activities indicates, Community Connections, Shared Experiences. This event has been designed to help the community build and rebuild bonds through an increased awareness of our shared experiences. So community connections and shared experiences will be our two focal points for the day. I can't imagine two more valuable themes for a community who has faced tremendous tragedy and challenges that you in Newtown have faced. So I have two goals for my presentation today. One is to shine a light on how victims of traumatic events have shared experiences regardless of the specifics of the tragedy they've suffered. And two is to examine the issue of community connections in the recovery environment following a tragedy. So I want to first begin by briefly giving you some insight and a little background data into the impact of traumatic events on both children and adults. So I have a few slides. I'm not going to have a lot of slides, but I do have a few. So this slide depicts kind of the big picture trajectory of the psychological impact of large-scale disasters on communities. And I just want to explain it to you briefly. This stage here, warning or threat period, doesn't exist for all disasters or tragedies. Sometimes there are warnings, sometimes there are threats about the impending tragedy, but not always. So what happens, there's this period, then there's the impact, whatever it is, whatever the tragedy is. You had your tragedy here, maybe it was a natural disaster, whatever. There's an impact, and psychologically the community takes a nosedive. However, immediately after, all the help rushes in. So whatever that help looks like, Red Cross, support from other communities, support from within the community, all the efforts that flood into the community to help it recover and to help it stabilize following that terrible blow. That heroic period really starts to bring the community back to its feet, so to speak. There's a lot of community cohesion. This is a time when things, you know, given the lens of the tragedy that just happened, this is a time when there's actually a lot of good, warm feelings and community cohesion and people just, everybody moving kind of in the same direction. And it's a real kind of a honeymoon period. However, all of the help, support, resources, I shouldn't say all, but most, in many cases, of all of those resources that come flooding in are generally intended to be short-term. They're intended to prop things up, keep things from getting worse, and so forth. So they disappear as they were designed and intended to do. And then life, you start to realize what it's like to live life after the tragedy. And it's, you know, it kind of sets in where people start to realize, okay, so this is what life is like now, given what just happened. This is what we have to live with. And it just plain sucks. It stinks. And there's a period of disillusionment. And that's when you start to see problems. You know, that's when you start to see kind of the increase in depression and mental illness problems or mental health problems or domestic violence, substance abuse, all these kinds of things that we so often see after large-scale tragedies. And life doesn't feel very good in that period. Some people will move away, some people will, you know, just kind of give up and say, that's it, I can't deal with this, and start to have other problems of their own. However, that period also kind of reaches a bottom, and over time, we start to develop ways to go on, and life regenerates and we restabilize. It's not always easy. As you can see, this is a rocky, bumpy road. There are triggering events, there are anniversaries, there are a lot of things that make this a difficult road, that recovery. This point over here, this reconstruction, when this, I didn't draw this chart, this is a chart that someone else designed, but that I use a lot in training to kind of talk to communities about what it's like after disaster. This was designed to be higher than this on purpose, because all the things that happened here, all the resources, all the recovery strategies, the new training, all the people who've now been trained in this or that, or if it's a natural disaster, maybe you have a whole new infrastructure in terms of how you deal with water and floods and so forth. All of those things actually help to make the community stronger. So that if or when there's another tragedy, you're actually better prepared because of all that's happened with everything that you've gone through. So that's just kind of big picture. I want to take a look at individuals, and I want to start a little bit with children. So get the next slide. So this is what I've pulled together here, some information from, there have been about 96 studies that have looked at the impact of large-scale tragedies and terrorism specifically, actually, and their impacts on children. And those studies, when you boil it down and look at the significant results and so forth, some of the key findings are what I've pulled out and put on this slide. Generally speaking, girls are more likely than boys to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Boys are more likely than girls to show behavioral issues, conduct disorder, things that don't necessarily look like, a diagnosable, mental illness or mental health issue like PTSD. Age is not a factor. So in looking at all the studies that looked at the impact on children, one of the things that we know is that it doesn't matter if the children are 4 or 14 or 3 or 19, they're equally impacted. So one of the myths that's out there sometimes is that the younger children they'll forget about it. They're too young, or, don't tell them, they won't know, and, it won't impact them. That actually doesn't hold true. Man-made tragedies seem to, develop kind of slightly worse results for children compared to natural disasters. This one here, perceived threat to self, is a strong indicator as to whether or not somebody's going to develop some kind of psychological impact, negative psychological impact. And what that means is whether you were actually physically threatened in the moment with your life, or you were psychologically connected to that point in time and you perceived that it could have been you, that perceived threat is what's most important in serving as a predictor as to who's going to develop long-term impacts. So you may kind of think, oh, well, it's common sense. If you were there and you saw and your life was immediately threatened in that moment, you may think that that person's more likely to develop a negative psychological impact. But that's not actually the case, because we don't know there are so many factors that go into the impact and the person's support systems and who they are and even what happened to them in that morning before whatever occurred. So there are a lot of factors that go into the impact. But feeling like that could have been me is a strong indicator for future problems. The highest rates of PTSD show up between 6 and 12 months. And parent report studies show lower results than child report studies. What that means is that when we're looking at the impact on children, we really need to ask children, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Are you this? Are you having this? Are you having sleep? We need to ask them specific questions. Because if you ask their parents, they don't really know. And the studies show that the parents report at a lower incidence rate than if you ask the children directly. The most recent data we have on children, next slide, comes from actually the Boston Marathon bombing and the manhunt that followed that. And by the manhunt, some of you may know or not know that basically the Metro Boston area was locked down for a day, the Friday after the bombing, where a couple million people were asked to shelter in place and not go out of their homes. So what we found is that, first of all, the bombing was kind of characterized as a soft target. This was looked at in the sense that this was not a war zone. This was a family and child-friendly event where this happened, obviously. The study done by a guy named Jonathan Comer was a parent report study, and that was basically for efficiency because to run it through an IRB, to get approval, to ask kids questions would have taken forever. So he asked their parents. So we know that some of these reports might be underreported. But he ended up talking to 460 people, 460 respondents, and they were talking about their children aged 4 to 19 years old. The best predictors of PTSD in these children were pretty much equally significant. And that is if they saw a dead body, if they knew someone who was killed, or if they knew someone who was injured. It was about equally strong. It was worse for kids who both were had close exposure to the bombing, maybe were at the site or in the Copley Square, in kind of the immediate area where the bombing occurred, and if then they were impacted by the manhunt, so depending on where they lived. So if they lived kind of in that area where it was locked down and they had been at the kind of the bombing area, then those kids were more likely to have symptoms. Next slide. So for adults, I'll just give you a little bit on adults. This is a study that I actually did after 9/11. I was working with a group at the World Trade Center. We had 89 subjects over a 6-month period. We measured them 4 times during that 6-month period. On the first measurement, time 1, which was, I think, 9 days after, I think maybe not even 9 days, I think it was September 17th, about 43% of them had symptoms that could be diagnosed as acute stress disorder. You can't diagnose PTSD until a month after. So acute stress disorder, about 43%. At the 6-month period, about 21% still had those symptoms. That's actually, I mean, if you think about it, that's a lot of people, 21%. But remarkably, that's actually a low number. In Oklahoma City, 6 months after, it was about 38%. But we worked with them for 6 months. We actually worked with them for 1.5 years. But after 6 months of work and regular intervention and so forth, it was down to 21%. The strongest predictors were the intensity of their acute response and whether or not it included a dissociative component. So the people who were most kind of emotionally overwhelmed on that day, and just the best way to say it is just the ones who were most emotionally overwhelmed were the ones who were most likely to have problems 6 months later. The dissociative component, that means if you also had kind of an experience of being out of body or feeling totally numb or disconnected, or like this is kind of an unreal world right now, unreal situation that I'm in. So those 2 components combined were strong predictors. And again, this is the same thing that we saw with the children, that physical proximity was not significantly relevant, but perceived proximity was. And what that means is that we had all these folks worked at the World Trade Center. Their building collapsed. Some of them were at work already. Some of them were on their way to work. And some of them were still, somewhere outside the city. Not there, weren't physically threatened. However, it didn't matter. That physical proximity didn't matter in terms of what they looked like, symptomologically. What mattered is that sense of, that could have been me. A real sense of that could have been me. Okay, so we know that there's a lot that goes on for people after tragedy. And there's a lot going on here in Newtown. Can I have the next slide? So, I guess it was the Sandy Hook School Support Fund did a survey 1 year after the shootings here, and they asked you and your neighbors to describe some of the impacts that you were experiencing in direct relation to 1214. So I asked you the questions, in specific relation to 1214, tell us how your life's been changed. And this is what you said. 1,600 people, over 1,600 people responded and said 50% of them said, I'm experiencing a lot more stress in direct relation to 1214. 60% said they were feeling increased anxiety in relation to 1214. 40% experiencing depression, 40% are having difficulty concentrating, 36% are having sleep-related problems, and 25% reported relationship issues. So we know, and you know, that the impacts from traumatic events find ways further on into your life to bubble up, and they don't just go away. And as Clive mentioned, it's not 3 months, it's usually years. And so there are a lot of things to be mindful of and to watch for over that period of time. And we're going to talk about that today, and that's what we're all here to talk about today, and to kind of be on guard. So I just want to give you a little bit of what I think trauma survivors really need. When you see this kind of impact, next slide, there's a way that you need to work with people who've survived trauma. Can I get the next slide? These 3 things are what I tell communities wherever I go. Safety, predictability, and control. You have a lot of decisions to make when you're trying to recover from a traumatic event. You never know kind of what's right. Should we go this way? Should we go that way? Do we do this? Do we do that? And everybody recovers differently, so how do we know if we do this, we're going to hurt one, and we're going to help another? And so that it's very difficult. So I generally tell communities, organizations, whoever I'm working with, that ask yourself, use this lens, and ask yourself, is this going to enhance a sense of safety, predictability, or control for folks? And if the answer is yes to one or more of those, then do it. You're probably going to help somebody. Because these are the things that people lose, that's really your sense of the world is central to these three things. And I'm not going to focus a lot on those today, but just to kind of give you that as a little bit of a strategy for how I think about recovery. Okay, so in looking at all this data across all the tragedies that have been studied and all the different types of trauma, it quickly becomes clear that regardless of whether your tragedy happened on 12/14, 9/11, 10/2, 1/8, 4/15, 3/12, 8/22, or some other date, there are similarities that are shared by all victims of traumatic and violent events. And although each one of you has had your unique and personal experience in regard to the tragedy on December 14th, 2012, the similarities you share are indeed far greater than the differences. As a psychologist who's worked solely in the field of trauma for 25 years, my work has taken me all over the world and allowed me to talk with thousands of victims and survivors of horrific tragedies, ranging from terrorism and massive natural disasters that the whole world has witnessed, to individual private horrors that occur behind closed doors or on darkened streets. But reassuringly, in the time I've been doing this work, our understanding of the impact of traumatic events has grown exponentially. We now understand that what was once called shell shock is a physiological response which can be mapped on a neurological level. What was called railway spine for a time, because many train wreck survivors exhibited similar symptoms of anxiety and sleeplessness, has now come to be known as post-traumatic stress disorder. But more importantly, we've come to understand that it's the similarities, the shared experiences, not the differences, that are the key factors in creating a lasting impact for each and every trauma survivor. It's the similarities that matter most. It's the sudden, unpredictable, and violent nature of what happened. It's the death of the loved one or the fear of death for themselves and others that's similar. It's the incredible sense of loss and grief, the loss of someone they love and the loss of all the dreams that went with that person and that relationship. It's the sense of powerlessness. There may be no greater link among all victims than that sense of utter powerlessness. And finally, it's the irreversible nature of the trauma. No matter how supportive the recovery environment is, either among your family or friends or across the nation as a whole, that support will not erase what happened. These are the similarities all trauma survivors share. So in fact, here in Newtown, there may be more services, more money, and more awareness for the families of Sandy Hook, but there will be no more fulfillment of your greatest wish than there is for the mother whose child was washed from her arms in a tsunami, or for the young woman whose dreams of living happily ever after ended in a wheelchair after her neck was broken by her Prince Charming. The shared experience among these survivors is that common greatest wish, for it all to go away, for it all to just be a bad dream. And that wish will never come true for any of them. These are the similarities. These are the shared experiences. So in regard to our two themes today, community connections and shared experiences, the way I see it is that although every victim is a unique individual and every victimization is in fact different, I've come to understand that I can never assume I know the worst part of a tragedy for someone. No one can ever really walk in that victim's shoes. But the similarities that unite victims, the painful and tragic components, they far outweigh the differences between them. So given these similarities, shared experiences, and differences, what is the importance of community connections following a large-scale tragedy? Residents of Newtown have had shared experiences for decades, as in all communities. It's our shared past, our shared present, and our shared futures which play a significant role in tying us together as a community. Prior to 1214, there were perhaps not many surprises in your life. And honestly, this is how we like it. No one knows the value of predictability like someone who survived a tragedy. But in communities, those shared past, present, and futures help to bind us together. Our relationships with our neighbors, often highly dependent on our children, our schools, and our teams, help to define who we are as a community. So when a tragedy rips through a community and has at its center the children who have played such an important role in our lives as families, neighbors, and community, how do we prevent that tragedy from simply tearing the community apart? That's what we're here today to address, because we know the risks and we know the costs of allowing this tragedy to further erode the community. This type of erosion is not unknown following a large-scale disaster. It's often referred to as the disaster after the disaster. But it's not inevitable and it's not irreversible. In my work with traumatized communities, I often remind people that a traumatic event is like a magnifying glass. It enlarges whatever already exists in a community, both positive and negative. So following the shootings here, you saw a tremendous outpouring of support and cohesion and togetherness, all qualities that existed in this town and in all of you prior to 1214. But as the trauma continues to hold that magnifying glass in place, perhaps you've seen some negative qualities as well. It's these negative issues that threaten the community connections which are so important to promote and maintain. So what are some of the community connection issues we're facing? What are some of those topics that are threatening the connections among people? We'll see if any of these questions ring a bell for you. How does all that donated money get spent? Can parents whose children witnessed the shootings understand and relate to parents whose children were killed? And can parents whose children simply evacuated that day from the school understand and relate to parents whose children were witnesses? And what about the kids? Can they understand and relate to each other? The soccer field used to be a place where we all pulled in the same direction. Is there now awkwardness, tensions, and avoidance? Or what about the teachers? Can teachers who work at Sandy Hook understand and relate to teachers who don't? And what about residents who don't even have children, or whose children have already left the school system? How can they relate to anyone? And what about those in the community who are struggling emotionally, and everyone can see it, except them? What should we be doing differently now? Should we be politically active? Should we put our efforts into changing laws or on preventing mental illness? Do I tell people I'm from Newtown now, or do I just say, I'm from Western Connecticut? Is it okay to still be angry? Is it okay to forgive? Is that the new F word? Should we just move on? And how do we do any of this? How do we figure out the answers? How do we know whether we're moving in a good direction or one that's going to further disconnect us? How do we avoid the disaster after the disaster? Though these questions may sound harsh or crass, I strongly suspect that you have thought about these or others like them since 1214. And though I realize I may be treading on perhaps a sensitive area by posing these questions, addressing them honestly and compassionately as a community will facilitate the healing process for everyone and help prevent any post-disaster disasters from adding further insult to injury for your town. I wish I could tell you the answers were easy. I wish I could tell you that time will heal, but time doesn't heal. Time gives you the opportunity to heal. But the healing process is work and requires vigilance and active care. And that care, though often painful, is necessary. Much like treating a wound caused by a burn, the treatments, the application of ointments, the changing of bandages can all be extremely painful because those wound sites are understandably so sensitive. But if the bandages aren't changed and the ointments aren't applied, and we simply say the wounds are too sensitive to treat, then infection will undoubtedly set in. On a community level, you might call it faction infection, wherein the ripple effects of the trauma build until they become walls of water between people that feel too treacherous to navigate. I suspect that many of you have heard that phrase, the ripple effects of trauma. It refers to the fact that when a traumatic event occurs, it impacts not only those at the very center of the tragedy, but that it ripples through layers and layers of individuals and groups all around that center, okay? Layers that contain individuals and groups you may have never even considered impacted by the trauma. For example, I can't tell you how many schools I've been to following a tragedy in which everyone was completely focused on the children and perhaps the teachers, with little forethought about the custodians, the bus drivers, the lunch ladies. Yeah. Never assume you know the worst part of a tragedy for someone. After 25 years of work, I know I can make no assumptions about how a particular trauma has touched someone, how it's reached into some part of their being and threatened their sense of safety, predictability, or control, what it has done to their faith in God or in humanity. There are many components to a community, and you mustn't forget anyone in the recovery process. I suggest you adopt a no member left behind mentality. In a community such as Newtown, given its size and the nature of the tragedy that occurred here, I think it's safe to say there's not a single person in this community who has not experienced at least some ripple effect. And one of the reasons it's important to adopt a no member left behind mentality is because those members who may be at the outer circles in the ripple, well, they're the very people who are going to shore up the community for those who are closer to the center and the center of the impact, and they may need more time to stabilize. So those people in the outer circles are critical to containing the impact for the community at large. Just like the recovery process for each individual, the recovery process for each community is unique. Unfortunately, the vast majority of research in the field of trauma is focused on individuals. There's a gaping hole in our understanding of the community recovery process. For decades, the study of community mental health has simply meant the study of individual mental health services delivered in the community. Research on the mental health of the community as a whole is virtually non-existent. But there are some indicators that can help us, can help you here in Newtown, to chart a course for community connections, healing, and resilience. For instance, we know that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So a collection of individually resilient people does not equal a resilient community. Rather, it's a resilient community that is best able to care for its individual members. You have an opportunity today to hear from some members of the Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania community, which suffered the tragic death of 5 children in a shooting at their small Amish school in 2006. From what I know of their recovery process, I believe that their strong sense of community has been central to their healing and to preserving key structures and positive aspects of their culture. They are a group whose members are highly dependent on one another with much more contact than members of the typical U.S. suburban community, and much closer contact as well. But their interactions with each other prove to be a strength in their recovery process rather than a negative obstacle to be avoided or overcome. So I hope you have a chance to hear their community story today and see what lessons you might apply to your situation, although I know that each of the workshops will offer valuable lessons. One other thing we know is that no one recovers in isolation. While each of you has an individual story and has had your own individual path of pain and recovery, remember that you're not alone in your suffering, and that the journey to healing has many, many roads. And remember that you mustn't compare your road to another person's road. You're all on a journey you didn't ask to be on. I'd like to tell you a quick story to help make this point about the different approaches to healing. Following September 11th, I and a team of 6 other clinicians were working with a group of about 100 men and women whose building collapsed in the attack. Fortunately, they all escaped, and no one from their office was killed. As the city and nation began to stabilize and begin the healing process, there were countless events, gestures, programs, and services that took place. One of these uplifting events for New Yorkers happened 7 weeks after 9/11, when the Yankees made it to the World Series, and they played their first game in New York City. Even Red Sox Nation was pulling for the Yankees that night. Well, the day after that game, I got a tearful phone call from one of the women we'd been working with from the World Trade Center. She was distraught because she thought she had been doing so well in her recovery process. But something had happened the night before that caused her to relive the horror of 9/11 all over again. She told me about how she'd been sitting quietly and doing some knitting in her uptown apartment when she heard the sound of a loud plane overhead. But it sounded unusually loud, she thought, and close and low to the ground. And she just knew it was all happening again. She believed that plane was about to crash into her building. In a state of terror, she ran into her bedroom, crawled into the closet, and curled up in a ball, hoping and praying that she wasn't about to die. She stayed there for about half an hour, long after the loud noise was gone, before she felt brave enough to come out, trembling much the way she did on September 11th. I listened to her cry as she told me this story and heard her distress as she realized she was not as unscathed as she thought by the attacks. When she spoke to her neighbors and coworkers the next morning, she found out that many of them had also had a similar reaction to the loud noise they'd all heard. People from numerous areas across the city also feared that the sound of that loud, low-flying plane meant they were once again under attack. They were only marginally relieved when they figured out that those loud, low-flying jet fighters were the Blue Angels soaring overhead at the start of the World Series game in a salute to the victims of September 11th and to the President of the United States, who will be throwing out the first ball at the start of the game. A couple things came to mind for me when I hung up the phone after hearing her story and helping her find ways to calm herself and restabilize. I realized that although the country was moving forward and the games had once again begun, there were countless people like her in New York and elsewhere who would take years to recover and in fact would never be the same. Now, of course, I'd always known this with my head. I'm a trauma psychologist. This is what I do. I know that trauma has changed a person's life forever. But somehow that phone call made me know it in my gut. Another lesson I was reminded of from that phone call was that one person's healing, therapeutic, moving salute was another person's re-triggering of the trauma. When those jets flew overhead, I'm sure some people were moved to tears by the honor, while others, like my client, were moved to tears by the fear and horror. I was reminded that healing is a complex process and there are many roads to recovery. What works for one survivor won't necessarily work for the next. But with diverse treatment and recovery options, some which look like traditional mental health care, and some that might look like art projects or road races or soccer games or potluck dinners, we increase our chances of helping the community stay strong. As an aside, I want to encourage you to take part in the art project that's happening today here. It's an art project that is designed so that small pieces that you all contribute become a unified whole in the end, which is exactly what you hope for in the community, because each person has their own role in the community, and that community has to function as a unified whole. So take a few minutes, join your neighbors, and create a community recovery piece. Take part in that today. But these types of projects, along with many others, will contribute to the growing strength within your community. Throughout this growing process, you'll need to be on guard, because the factions that can develop following a tragedy, when people focus more on their differences than on their shared experiences, can severely interfere with the community's ability to regain its cohesion. If factions become a prominent component of the new normal, which so many of you know about, then the recovery environment can be increasingly toxic and the healing process increasingly difficult. But I'm encouraged to think that that is not going to happen here in Newtown. Events such as this one today, and seeing all the tremendous providers and the great programs going on out there, they're going to serve you well as you rebuild and restabilize. With the formation of your new recovery and resilience team, you have the opportunity to pull many, many resources together to work toward a common goal based on your shared experiences rather than on your differences. I'm hopeful that this team will be able to cross all party lines, so to speak, and will guide the town through some very difficult waters ahead. They will need your involvement and your support. I strongly encourage you to give it to them. I'd like to say a brief word or two to those who've dedicated themselves to help heal the children, adults, and community at large, the victim service providers. I have a brief but important message for you. I want to encourage you to consider your own self-care as an important element of providing good care to others. For us, the victim service providers, what happened on 12/14 cannot be separated from the countless other events of victimization we see on a regular basis. As those whose role it is to help victims put the pieces of their lives back together, we carry an important and costly burden. I realize that this is the work we choose to do and this is the work we love to do, but we need to take care of ourselves in order to give care to others. In particular, if you're also a resident of Newtown, you have a shared traumatic reality with all the other members of this community. And as such, an added level of risk that compassion fatigue or secondary trauma will undermine your ability to be an effective provider. Because of the nature of our work, we regularly ingest traumatic images and stories, and unless we find ways to help us process or digest those images and stories, we will begin to show the effects of traumatic exposure. Digesting or processing the traumatic material is the goal of therapy, and as providers we must keep in mind our own need to process all of what we carry as a daily part of how we help survivors. You have to take care in order to give care. In closing, I'd like to share with you a definition of community resilience that I happen to like. Community resilience can be defined as the ability to take deliberate, meaningful, collective action toward a common goal in the face of adversity. So as you attempt to stay cohesive and resilient as possible, and to avoid any signs of faction infection, remember to look to your similarities, not your differences. Focus on your strengths, not your weaknesses. Talk to your neighbors. Spend time together, and take an active part in the health and well-being of your community. If you take care of it, then it will take care of you. Thank you.